Hope this is audible. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a funny issue I'm discussing today. I mean, climate alarm, I think, belongs to a special class of issues where they're characterized by a claim for which, despite claims of universal agreement and so on, there's actually no evidence. And yet it appeals to the point where we're dealing with signs. There's a cold day, that's a sign. A warm day, that's a sign. This is not unique, as I say, in human history, and there are a lot of examples. I'll go through three that are interesting to me. One is Malthus' theory of overpopulation, very popular to the present. The other is social Darwinism, and the third is the Dreyfus affair. Each of these issues engendered opposition. Only one of them actually led, the Dreyfus affair, to a societal polarization where you had the whole society broken up over it. More commonly, you had believers who form a movement. Look at it. All of these issues have been studied in books, and we can only go through it very quickly. But the issue of climate alarm is actually a bit special in that it appeals to a large number of interests and has strong claims on the scientific community. It also, like the other issues, has the potential to cause exceptional harm to an unprecedented number of people. Now, I'm not talking about warming, I'm talking about our policies that can hurt innumerable people very badly. There's been persistent opposition, but mainly in the US and elsewhere, surprising lack of interest. I mean, every poll I know in America or the UK shows that ordinary people, most people, believe there's an issue but don't regard it as important. You ask people, do you regard it as an issue? Yes. How much would you pay extra for a liter of gasoline? 5 cents. I mean, it's not serious. But all these issues have a certain characteristic. There's profound immorality pretending to be virtue. Let's look at some of these issues. Malthus is well known to all of you. He had the peculiar theory wherein he claimed that the linear growth of food loses out to the exponential growth of population. His view has been popular among academics for 2 centuries. I don't know how many of you are academics, but you can have a discussion with people on anything. You say, the real problem is population, and they'll nod their head. And yet, it's worth noting that Malthus had no evidence that food supply would increase only linearly, nor did he have any evidence for exponential population growth. In his paper, he estimated an exponential timescale for population growth of 25 years. He based that on the population of North America. Remember, this was the beginning of the 19th century. And he considered population growth in North America and ignored the role of immigration, which was the major source of population growth. Eventually, Malthus acknowledged his problems, but as you all know, the enthusiasm for his anti-human conclusions remains strong. And that's quite astonishing if you think about it a little bit. I mean, you've had the Green Revolution, which has produced unprecedented growth in agricultural productivity. You have India, where the population has tripled since independence and famine has disappeared. none of this changes anyone's mind. The fact that Chad, with one of the lowest population densities of any country, is desperately poor, or that the Netherlands, with the densest population of almost any country in the world, is rich, never strikes a believer as strange. The growth of cities, the movement of workers from the farm to the city, and for much of the developed world, immigration, do in fact convince privileged people that there are too many other people around. But Malthusian framework simply formed a framework for something they were eager to believe under those circumstances, and not any objective basis for policy. Social Darwinism was another one, became very popular in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, almost immediately followed on Darwin's theory of evolution. The whole idea of the survival of the fittest appealed to certain people, and so did its eventual correlation, eugenics. It's a theory without support that was widely accepted and at times had horrific consequences. To be sure, The Origin of the Species was a brilliant piece of work. It presented a theory whereby natural selection and mutations could account for biological evolution. It offered valuable insights into the changes in the beaks of various birds, which was the main observational basis. But it was not meant to describe societal evolution. Nevertheless, the notion of the survival of the fittest applied to society had obvious appeal to those who perceived themselves to be the fittest and who naturally regarded the application as scientifically justified. It was a small step to eugenics, which, in case you don't realize it, was the counterpart in most of the developed world to today's environmentalism, at least for the first third of the 20th century. It was endorsed by, quote, the best people, George Bernard Shaw, Margaret Sanger, Alexander Graham Bell, Theodore Roosevelt were all enthusiasts of eugenics. And what was astonishing about eugenics to me with a mathematical background is it's one of those rare cases where you literally had a rigorous mathematical theorem that eugenics would not be able to significantly affect the gene pool. This is called the Weinberg-Hardy theorem. And I don't have to add that for the best people, mathematics is of no importance. And so Malthusian population fears continue to the present. But eugenics suffered a significant setback by the Nazis in their policy. The Dreyfus affair was also curious in this respect. I mean, you had a case in 1894, an officer in the French army was accused of passing secret French military information to the Germans. It turns out there was never any evidence to support this accusation. Nevertheless, there was a strong desire on many people in France, part of many people in France, to believe the accusation. There were a number of reasons for this. There was, of course, a certain basic anti-Semitism in France, but I think the more important thing was the humiliation France suffered in its loss to Prussia in 1871 in the Franco-Prussian War, and the need to blame such loss on the perfidy, the betrayal of a group that some considered to be outside. The Nazis also had this stab in the back theory for World War I. It was a similar instinct. Dreyfus was tried several times. He was sentenced to Devil's Island. But there were prominent people in France, especially Émile Zola, who were incensed by the obvious injustice. They campaigned for him. The issue literally split France in half. partly because it became involved in the battle between Catholics and secularists. Eventually, Dreyfus was exonerated. Why? Because the actual spy was identified and beyond any denial. That's rare, that you actually get something so definite that believers can no longer sustain the belief. Now we come to the issue of global warming and climate change, and that's a bit extreme compared to these three earlier ones, because it appeals to so many special interests that want to believe in claims of catastrophe regardless of the lack of evidence. Here are some of them. You have economists. There are always arguments between free market economists and economists on the left who believe in planning. And this, for them, is the great case of market failure. They're always looking for market failure. You have UN apparatchiks, who see global warming as the route to global governance, and they say so. You have the usual picture of third world dictators who see guilt over global warming as providing a convenient claim on aid, which, as many of you know, is the transfer of wealth from the poor and rich countries to the wealthy and poor countries. You have environmental activists who love any issue that has the capacity to frighten the gullible into making contributions to their numerous NGOs. You have crony capitalists who see the immense sums being made available for sustainable energy. You have government regulators for whom the control of a natural product of breathing is a dream come true. And one of the most remarkable groups I've encountered are the newly made billionaires who find the issue of saving the planet to be suitable to their grandiose pretensions. They need something that is worthy of their attention. At any rate, you could go on a while on it, but it turns out even the fossil fuel industry is generally willing to go along, and that was a bit of a surprise to me. But, they have good economists, they have good planners. They know there's currently no replacement for fossil fuels. The closest possibilities, nuclear and hydro, are despised by the environmentalists. As long as fossil fuel companies have a level playing field and can pass the expenses to you, they're satisfied. Given the nature of corporate overhead, when they pass the expenses to us, they can actually charge extra. And so it becomes a profit center. Now, even so, you will always find some companies tempted to unlevel the playing field and go along. British Petroleum was obvious on this when they changed their name to Beyond Petroleum, playing greenwashing. But, they don't even need that for this issue. Within the science, the situation is equally grim. You have huge sums of government and private funding that have become available for what was initially a small backwater field. This was not, most of you, I think, have attended college. When you attended university, do you remember that the most brilliant students were studying climate? I don't think so. There are plenty of fields like that. It's not that there's anything wrong with them, but the notion of thousands of the world's greatest climate scientists almost seems inconsistent with what anyone's personal experience is. The science itself has become easy when you have these models that I call malleable. That is to say, all they're required to do is to be able to be adjusted, to be consistent with the data, and then you supplement it by imaginary implications, and we'll see that. Very often what you find in this field is, instead of trying to be more precise, you try to be less precise to leave it possible to be consistent with some catastrophic prediction. This is the opposite of what science is supposed to be. When you have questions within the scientific community, as some of you know, you're immediately met with personal attacks, and in the case of academia, loss of funding and difficulty in publishing. For any young scientist, to question global warming is essentially suicidal. Science is not the only victim of this situation. I mean, let's remember that affordable energy has been the primary vehicle for the greatest advance in human welfare in human history. Remember, the Greeks already had the steam engine, but they didn't need it. They had slaves. When we used it, we essentially ended slavery of a sort. Ordinary people today can enjoy a standard of living or a quality of life that was not available to aristocrats 2 centuries ago. And yet, we are considering policies that will deny this benefit to over 1 billion humans who still lack electricity. For billions more, energy will be less affordable, leading to increased poverty. And poverty itself is a major factor in reduced life expectancy. I think it requires a very strange obtuseness to ignore the basic immorality of this issue. Although these issues have strong political consequences, I'm not sure their origin is itself political. As far as I can tell, politics always is looking for some cause that fits its need. However, once the issue becomes a passionate belief, it becomes impervious to argument. And given how dangerous some of these positions are, it's important to know how to avoid them, but I'm not sure we do. I'll go over some examples of how science has been misrepresented. I doubt these will change many minds, but this is a case where belief inevitably trumps reality, and one is, in the modern world, free to choose one's narrative, as they say. Okay, global warming, is it political or scientific? The two are so intertwined that it's hard to tell sometimes. In 1989, politically, I was still on the left, and I was told that, as such, I should not take a position questioning global warming. Never understood that. But there is, in addition, something I call the iron triangle of alarm, which keeps the issue from being resolved. I've shown this years ago. I mean, you start out with scientists making meaningless or ambiguous statements. You then have advocates and media translate the statements into alarmist declarations, and the politicians respond by feeding the scientists more money. So, this is a wonderful circle. Everyone benefits except people. In terms of the IPCC, it's interesting. The yellow box refers to Working Group 1 in particular. That's the scientific working group. And if you look carefully at the document, it is fairly reserved. It mentions the problems with care. It has a bias. It rejects too much criticism of models, but it still mentions where there are problems. You then have working groups 2 and 3. They really belong to the green part. Working group 2 is impacts, working group 3 is mitigation, and they all start out by assuming the worst in working group 1 with no qualification. So they're part of the second thing. You also have the complication that, of course, politicians not only respond to the alarm by feeding more money, but they can also be advocates in many cases. So it's not as neat a picture as one would like. should the scientist himself or herself ever feel guilt over the matter, there are two irresistible factors. The advocates define public virtue. Even if I say, and I think so in my heart, that this is an immoral issue, for most people, they're told this makes you a good person, and that's attractive. And as far as places like the US go, if you have research funds, you need to charge overhead 60% more. That goes to supplying the administrators with their salaries. So the administrators are delighted with anything that brings in more funds. So you have that situation at the university. You have, as you know from the media, any little event somehow becomes evidence for fear, for alarm. The one I'm going to focus on is the iconic statement of the IPCC. And that is the statement for the last 3 or 4 IPCC documents. They always have a press release at the end, and that becomes, people say it's the executive summary that people, summary for policymakers. As far as I can tell, no one reads that. Certainly nobody reads the document. The only thing that comes through is the press release. And the press release always says something like, most of the warming over the past 50 years is due to man. Okay? The only thing that changes is the first time it was the balance of evidences. The next time it was we are 90% certain. The last time it was 95% certain. Nobody knows what these mean. The statement remains the same. Now the question is there any reason why this statement should be alarming? They're talking about the change over the last 50 years. That's about a half degree. Most of it would be about a quarter of a degree. Here is the change over the period since 1850. You have maybe 3/4 of a degree. The pink fuzz is the uncertainty, roughly. And that's not the true uncertainty. The true uncertainty would be greater. That's just the statistical scatter of the data. Here is a picture I have earlier, the later one. I have this one from April 2008. The Boston Globe, our local newspaper, publishes this each day. It has the record for the preceding 30 days. And the blue bars here are the high and low temperature for the day in Boston. The dark gray are the climatological highs and low temperatures for the day. And the light gray are the record-breaking highs and lows for the day, sometime in the past. What is the red line in the middle? The red line in the middle, its thickness represents the range of global mean temperature anomaly for the past century. We're talking about really small changes. Let me be clear what I mean by that. What I mean is take this whole graph on that scale and from the top to bottom, that's the width of that red line here. It's meaningless when somebody says, I feel it's getting warmer or colder. Nobody feels this. They feel the range, they feel the trend, they feel all sorts of things, but they don't feel a quarter of a degree. Your body temperature isn't measured to that accuracy. Not only that, the recent warming episode they're speaking about is not unprecedented. On this very same picture from the Hadley Center, you see that circle? That's an almost identical warming that occurred between 1919 and 1940, when the IPCC acknowledges it could not be due to man. Just for fun, look at these two on the same scales, everything else is the same, and tell me which was the 1919 to 1940 or the 1957 to 2008 period. They're indistinguishable. And yet one is nominally due to man and one is not. Now, the last thing I'd mention about this is, okay, so you got your quarter of a degree out of the change, you got 3/4 of a degree in a century. The IPCC is only claiming that, most of it in recent years is due. Let's make a more extreme assumption that all of it for the past 150 years is due to man, all of it. Well, you can take models with different sensitivities ranging from, 1/2 degree to 4.5 degrees, 5 degrees, and you can calculate what you would have expected over the last 150 years. Remember, the complexity in a GCM, a global circulation model, is because they're supposed to determine the sensitivity internally. If you know the sensitivity, you can use a simple model. Okay, so the question is, how is it possible that all this range of sensitivity of IPCC models all fit the data? And the reason is, all the modelers have used something that the IPCC says is unknown, aerosols, to be part of human missions. So when you see due to human emissions, they don't mean just greenhouse gases. They mean aerosols, and they mean aerosols as an arbitrary unknown. So in this table here, you have how much of the greenhouse warming had to be subtracted from each model sensitivity in order to make it match the data. So you have to, even with a model that has 1.5 degrees sensitivity for a doubling of CO2, you have to get rid of about 25% of the warming to match the data. By the time you're up to 3, 4, and 5, you have to begin taking away more than half the forcing. Now, this corresponds to about 1.5 watts per meter squared. Recently, a paper appeared by Bjorn Stevens, trying to narrow the uncertainty in the aerosols. What he comes up with is a best estimate for the aerosols being bounded by 0.5 watt per meter squared. Remember, here we're talking about 3 watts per meter squared, getting rid of 1.5, getting rid of 3/4. And he says it's almost impossible they exceed 1 watt per meter squared. Essentially, it's saying that even if you were to account for all the warming with it, you still wouldn't be able to do much better than 1.5 degrees. If you were to reduce it to 49 or 51% of the warming, then even 1.5 degrees becomes implausible. If you begin worrying about a degree, it's worth remembering that we have already, for whatever reason, seen about 3/4 of a degree since the last century, and that, forgetting about wars, this has been accompanied by the improvement of all indices of human welfare, including environmental quality. How do we end up being afraid of 1/100th of a degree or things like this? It just doesn't make sense. But the question is the IPCC attribution even correct? And, so here is the picture. Here is the instrumental record of temperature. I was just told that it shows it's in perfect agreement with the models. So here's the temperature, not the surface air temperature. It's going no place. What does that mean? It means that there is something at least as big as greenhouse warming. You may not know what it is, but there's something else. What did the IPCC attribution depend on? It depended on the assumption that all other sources of variability were smaller. And that was based on the models, which don't represent things like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, El Nino, and so on. They're saying, well, that's not true. The model natural variability is inadequate. There's something here that's just as big that prevented whatever. This is a comparison of the models with the observations of lower tropospheric air temperature, but the same would be true for surface temperature. The models form this spaghetti, peculiar on this. Here's the picture of the temperature. This is, again, surface temperature from the Hadley Center. I mentioned this for those who went to my earlier lecture, where it was said that if you use surface temperature, you would see it's behaving just like the models. I don't know where that came from. But, okay, so how did the BBC respond? Well, they responded by the assumption that their audience could not deal with numbers, and you can tell that. Skeptics disagree. They insisted it is unlikely that temperatures will reach the dizzy heights of 1998 until 2030 at the earliest. Look at what they call the dizzying heights of 1998. I mean, it's about 0.05 degrees warmer than something else. Where does this language come from? What about the future? Well, it's obvious that only models with high sensitivity lead to potential alarm, and high sensitivity, I would argue, is grossly unlikely. Now, here you could argue, well, that's my view, I'm a skeptic. All scientists agree differently. But I think it's worth seeing what scientists on the other side actually say. So I've taken some. Here's a letter that is signed. It was a letter to the Financial Times. The date is 2010. It was a letter by the president then of the Royal Society, Martin Rees, a prominent astrophysicist, and the president of the National Academy of Sciences, Ralph Cicero. Both endorse action to stop warming. That's no question. But look at what they say, and you may not be able to read it, so I'll try and read it for you. Calculations demonstrate that this effect is very likely responsible for the gradual warming observed over the past 30 years, and that global temperatures will continue to rise, superimposing a warming on all the other effects that make climate fluctuate. Uncertainties in the future rate of this rise, stemming largely from feedback effects on water, vapor, and clouds, are topics of current research. Think about that sentence for a moment. The first part is trivial. The second part is what the question is. They're saying that we don't know the answer. But what do they conclude? Our academies will provide the scientific backdrop for the political and business leaders who must create effective policies to steer the world toward a low-carbon economy. So even though we don't know what the answer is, we know what we're supposed to do. There was an interview subsequently on the BBC with Ralph Cicero, and I enjoyed the interview. The interviewer is John Humphreys. He says, "You don't sound, if I can use the word, apocalyptic. I mean, you're not saying if we don't do these things, we're going to go to hell in a handbasket, we're going to fry in a few years." And Cicero answered, "Well, there are people who are saying those things, John." And Humphrey said, "So, but not you." And Ralph answers, "No, I don't think it's useful. I don't think it gets us anywhere. And this is the crucial thing, we don't have that kind of evidence." Huh? Okay, now some people are a little bit more honest on it. You have Mike Hume, who is director of the Tyndall Center at the University of East Anglia. And this is a center for concern on global warming. A lot of it initiates there. Here's his statement. To state that climate change will be catastrophic hides a cascade of value-laden assumptions which do not emerge from empirical or theoretical science. And then we come to Gavin Schmidt. You may not know who he is, but he's Jim Hanson's successor at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Study, and he runs a website, realclimate.org, which is probably the most important defender of global warming alarm. And here's his statement. General statements about extremes are almost nowhere to be found in the literature, but seem to abound in the popular media. It's this popular perception that global warming means all extremes have to increase all the time, even though if anyone thinks about that for 10 seconds, they realize it's nonsense. So those are the defenders of warming. One should note also, in terms of physics, that extremes outside the tropics, and even within the tropics, but outside the tropics certainly, depend on the temperature difference between the tropics and the poles. And that's something every model and every theory suggests should get less, not more, in a warmer world. So here we have the basic theory, sort of like the Weinberg-Hardy theorem, saying in a warmer world, you'll have fewer extremes and less intense storms. But since that isn't scary, you reverse it. At any rate, how about politicians? How did they respond to that? Well, here is John McCain in 2007 talking about the iconic statement. The recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded there is a greater than 90% chance that greenhouse gases released by human activities, like burning oil in cars and coal in power plants, are causing most of the observed warming. And what does he conclude? This report puts the final nail in denial's coffin about the problem of global warming. Where did that come from? But John McCain is nowhere compared to our Secretary of State, John Kerry. He's just wonderful. Gave a long talk in Indonesia last February, and it reminded me of a comment about an American playwright, Lillian Hellman. There was a critic of hers, Mary McCarthy, who hated her, and made the comment that every word she said, including the and was untrue. Well, here is Kerry, and I'll just outline some of the red. I've included much of the text, plus a website for you if you want to read it in its entirety. Starts, when I think about the array of global climate, of global threats, think about this. Terrorism, epidemics, poverty, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, all challenges that know no borders. The reality is that climate change ranks right up there with every single one of them. It is a challenge that I address in nearly every single country I visit as Secretary of State, because President Obama and I believe it is urgent that we do so. When he comes to the science, the next red point is the science is absolutely certain. Then he has that it is happening faster than they ever predicted, ever in recorded history. And when they tell us that we humans are the significant cause, let me tell you something, we need to listen. Well, not even the IPCC claimed that. I mean, that is coming from nowhere. Then he comes to 97% of climate scientists have confirmed that climate change is happening and that human activity is responsible. Well, that's sort of the IPCC statement, except they only said most. And that, as we see, did not imply alarm. And they agreed that if we continue to go down the same path, that we are going down today, the world as we know it will change dramatically for the worse. I couldn't find that anywhere in Working Group 1. So now you continue, well, of course, you think it's a complex issue. Our Secretary of State, who virtually flunked out of Yale and probably took one science course for poets, doesn't think so. I know sometimes I can remember from when I was in high school and college, some aspects of science or physics can be tough, chemistry. But this is not tough. This is simple. Kids at the earliest age can understand this. Aren't you glad to know that? I mean, so really, at any rate, he begins to discuss the science. And I'll leave it to you, but he starts saying, well, CO2 is a ½ inch and it's at the top of the atmosphere. It's a well-mixed gas. It's not at the top of the atmosphere. He continues every statement he makes, including the last one. It's called the greenhouse effect because it works exactly like a greenhouse in which you grow a lot of the fruit you eat here, is untrue. So much for the young kids who can understand this. Then he goes into that standard routine. We saw the temperature didn't change for 17, 18 years. It's fluctuating. And of course, that occurred at the end of a period when it had been warming. So these are going to be the warmer years on record. It has nothing to do with the trend. In this paragraph, he confuses the two, but he goes further than that. When it comes to sea level, he confuses 20 centimeters with a meter, because he felt they're both small and one has more documentation. I don't know what he's thinking on this. But at any rate, so there you have the politicians and what they do with ambiguous information, or information that is not alarmist. But then he ends up with something, worst case scenario, even if they're wrong, will make the world a better place. And in doing that, there's the usual attempt to confuse CO2 with pollution. CO2, as you know, is essential to life, and increasing CO2 is a benefit. Pollution, we know how to control. We have it by law and by device. But then that doesn't stop him. We need to move, as usual, with politicians. We need to move together now. We don't have time for people who want to get in the way of doing what we regard as important. He begins blaming it on big companies and corporations. That's always a good winning point for a populist politician. But as I've discovered, the big companies couldn't care less. They just want to know what the policy is and go along with it and make their money. But what does he suggest is the first thing you have to do? First and foremost, we should not allow a tiny minority of shoddy scientists and science and extreme ideologues to compete with scientific fact. Okay. So much for scientific inquiry, so much even for the scientific IPCC, Scientific Working Group. All of them deal with it as not fact. Indeed, the only thing he's showing, and this is in this statement, this is not opinion, this is about facts, this is about science. The science is unequivocal, equivocal. And those who refuse to believe it are simply burying their heads in the sand. Now, President Obama and I believe very deeply that we do not have time for a meeting anywhere of the Flat Earth Society. Okay, he's saying he not only doesn't understand climate, he doesn't understand science. That's no surprise. Now, there are other political figures who are more honest than our Secretary of State. I would include that Christiana Figueres, who's executive secretary of the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change. Her statement is, she really doesn't care about the science. This is the first time in the history of mankind that we're setting ourselves the task of intentionally, within a defined period of time, to change the economic development model that has been reigning for at least 150 years since the Industrial Revolution. Well, that's an aim, and I don't think she cares about the science. That's the aim she has, and if it serves her purpose, that's fine. Now, Mrs. Figueres is not alone in taking this approach. Pope Francis has an advisor, Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez Madariaga, and he came out, I think a week or so, with severe criticism of movements in the United States that have preemptively come out in opposition to Francis' planned encyclical on climate change. Quoting him, "The ideology surrounding environmental issues is too tied to a capitalism that doesn't want to stop ruining the environment because they don't want to give up their profits." I think this will be an interesting thing to watch, because my understanding is Pope Francis will not come out with that encyclical. It'll be interesting to see if he does. We do know that Madariaga has been urging him to. It's difficult to know whether the political positions represent dishonesty or ignorance or both. As I say, at least the political figures who say they have a policy they wish to endorse and this serves their purpose are in some ways more honest, because one of the things you can say about any proposed measures, certainly Kyoto, it was always a joke, because you could calculate, even if you believe the worst models, all it would do would be change the temperature in 2100 by a fraction of a degree, 0.1, 0.01. It was just absurdly small. To get anything significant, you'd have to know how to control CO2. We don't know how to do that. We know the response is not proportional to what we're doing in any strict sense. But, so the policies are not likely to be relevant to the climate. But, maybe you could do something if you rolled back emissions to before the industrial era. But that would seem a bit extreme. And you can't expect any of the developing world to do this. That's huge. Even if you have a solution for part of it or could replace it, you're still not getting rid of the issue. Now, how do people defend this? It's always defended by the consensus, right? How can you disagree with 97%? How can you disagree with anything? Well, the position itself is a peculiar one, and the novelist Michael Crichton eloquently noted in a lecture at Caltech. Now, I should mention, Michael Crichton was not just a writer. He was an interesting character. He graduated with highest honors from Harvard. He was a physician. He was a research physician. He had a good career. He just liked writing better, and it made him a lot more money. His comment is excellent. In science, consensus is irrelevant. What is relevant is reproducible results. The greatest scientists in history are great precisely because they broke with the consensus. There is no such thing as consensus science. If it's consensus, it isn't science. If it's science, it isn't consensus, period. Now let's ignore his wisdom. Let's ask, what is there a consensus over? Is there anything that most scientists do agree with? Sure there is. Almost everyone I know, including myself, agrees that climate change exists. We agree that there has been warming since the Little Ice Age ended. We agree that man's emissions can contribute something to climate change. After all, the flutter of a butterfly's wing can contribute something. We also tend to agree that levels of CO2 in the atmosphere have been increasing for whatever reason. For this, there's widespread agreement. But none of this implies alarm, except in the imagination of the politicians and the green campaigners and the media. And given the iron triangle I described, it's unlikely, I think, that many scientists will complain about the misrepresentation of the consensus. In view of the very serious implications of the proposed policies alleged to deal with global warming, such as the restriction of access to electricity for 1.3 billion human beings currently without such access, and the increased poverty for billions more with its obvious implications for health and longevity, not to mention foregoing the well-established benefits of added CO2. It's clear that we really do have a potential planetary emergency. However, as is so often the case, the emergency does not arise from science and technology. It arises from politics. It's worth examining whether science can play a role in the mitigation of this emergency. It is doubtful whether the answer will consist in research grants, but science has a lot at stake. It has, over the last several centuries, earned as its rationale being the most effective tool for objective assessment. We're squandering it. And with it, we're destroying the basis for public trust and support. Thank you for your attention. I hope that all of you will sleep better knowing that we only have to deal with the normal run of catastrophes provided by both nature and our political leaders, and that man-made climate change is unlikely to compete with these traditional sources. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for your talk. We have some time now for questions and comments. So if you want to raise a question, please state also your name so we know who's saying anything. I think you could roll back to the last one. I think that was a very important conclusion you made about science. Because it's the science itself that is at stake here. If we cannot work as science should do, then science will be mistrusted, and that is very serious for our future. Well, any comments or questions?
Yeah.
Yes, comment.
Just very fascinating. Living in Norway, we see that the Norwegian state is gaining from selling gas to Europe as a solution to CO2 release to replace coal burning. So it builds on your theory. It's not only individual companies that are there, it's also the Norwegian state and the oil and gas industry in this business.
I don't think any of these parts, I mean, Germany is building coal-fired plants because the Greens don't want nuclear. England is just about ready to ban windmills. The Green movement in the US might care about a fish, but they don't care about thousands of eagles. I mean, all of this has a strong element of hypocrisy. Sure, you're right.
Yeah, man in front of you, yes?
Lindzen. My question is regarding the issues we see in, for instance, California, where we have desertification and less rain in years. And a lot of the arguments from the Greens are this is reason global warming and climate change. And how is this coming into play?
Yeah, I mean, everything is. There's a website, which is a delight, all the things that have been attributed to global warming, obesity, prostitution, whatever you want. California has several problems. One, it has It is a desert, for which one of its most important activities is agriculture. Can you imagine the irrationality of growing rice in a desert, which is what California does? They have water supply problems, but they also are totally irrational in their use of water. They have prevented the development of reservoirs because the environmental movement is against it. And they've had droughts before. Now, we've gotten into the habit, it snows, it's due to global warming. We have a drought, it's due to global warming. We have floods, it's due to global warming. By now, I think the public at large knows it's a joke. The only people who don't know it's a joke are academics.
Yes, here in the IFE. I've been always wondering, I've seen so many graphs showing the temperatures going back to 100 years and 200 years and even last 20 years. But none of these graphs shows error.
Shows what?
Error. This one? No? Error bars.
Error bars. Oh, yeah.
They show error bars.
Well, I tried to show it with the pink fuzz. They don't show it because they don't expect anyone to look at the graph. In other words,
Fundamental thing we learn at school, error bars.
of course,
They show them. Why don't people ask for these things?
well, you know, to be fair, newspapers, when they show graphs, almost never show error bars. Moreover, they never expect the reader to look at the scale. I'll give you an example that has, you know, some importance to some people. Every day the newspaper might show the stock market index, right? Okay, now that doesn't have an error bar because we know exactly what it was each time. But what it does have is it looks the same whether the market went up 10 points or 1,000 points. And that's how people look at graphs.
You showed the figures that the models didn't work compared to observations.
Yeah.
And I think that's well demonstrated. What about the future development of models?
It's a tough issue, and I don't foresee a great deal of improvement. There's been no improvement, really, for over 20 years. More than that, in 1979, the Charney report gave the same range for sensitivity, 1.5 to 4.5, as the fifth IPCC assessment. I explained earlier today why that is, because it depends on small changes in a feedback factor. It's a function 1 over 1 minus f. You start out with f equals plus 0.5, then any little thing you do moves it all over the place. The trouble with it is the following. The models are not precise implementations of the equations. You have the Navier-Stokes equation for the fluid motion. You have the Schwarzschild equation for the radiative transfer. You have the thermodynamic equations for phase change and so on. All those we know how to do. But the scales that are important range from turbulence at centimeter scales, clouds at meter scales, kilometer scales, and you have the models that the best model, the biggest model in the world, which takes forever to run even on today's most powerful computer, still talking about 10 kilometers. And the amount of output it has is huge. Nobody foresees, one, that we're going to get down to the centimeter scale. Nobody believes that the round-off error in the computers that we will have will be sufficient to deal with the differences between such close spacing. And as a result, what comes out of the model is not the solution to the underlying equation, but some very peculiar approximation. And in the best numerical analysis, of course, you can prove the convergence, that you get closer as you come. Nobody has ever been able to do that with the models we use for climate. Maybe the closest analog is economics models. And we know that they don't work very well.